We are now standing at the entrance of Potter's Field, formerly known as Pioneer Cemetery. Most people know it as Potter's Field. We are in the upper corner of the new section of Oakland Cemetery, and we're near the Veterans Memorial. But if you look right up there, you'll find that there's a large rock in the middle of this path. Some small flowers right there. And if you walk up that path, about a quarter of a mile, you will find Potter's Field. It's a little bit of a hike, but it's not a bad trail. It's well worth it. Now it comes as a surprise to many folks that the original Warren Cemetery was not over here at Oakland, but instead was located at a position between 4th and 5th Avenue, over in the main part of town, between Water Street and East Street. It was started in the 1820s and soon became full. As Warren grew, it needed more land. And so in the 1850s, a company was formed, and that company developed Oakland Cemetery. During that period of time, many of Warren's early pioneers were buried over in that cemetery. During that period of time, for example, one Eli Granger decided, while they were volunteering to clear the land there, it was all forested, just like the area around us is here. And so one Eli Granger, as I mentioned, said, "This hickory tree is where I would like to be buried." Uniquely or remarkably, just a few weeks later, he drowned in the Conowongo Creek, which that cemetery faced. So they buried him right there. As I said, many early pioneers were buried there, and many of the names that are familiar to Warren residents were buried at first there. But as I mentioned, that cemetery got full even after additional space was added, and Oakland was started. Now, the reason I didn't put a cemetery over here in the first place was the south side was inaccessible. You had to come here by ferry. So there were no bridges in those days. So all the original cemetery plots were left to family and friends to move over here. I am standing in many of the original plots that were there, or at least some of them. There are around 48 plots here. This is Potter's Field, or Pioneer Cemetery as it's officially known. Now, this particular cemetery, as I mentioned, has about 48 marked tombstones. In the early cemetery, many of the people did not have gravestones. So since it was left to family and friends to move the graves over here, most of the people were moved, according to Schenk's History of Warren County, which was published in the 1880s. Now notice I said most. Eli Granger, that I mentioned earlier, was buried there, but there's no record of him being buried at Oakland. As far as we know, everyone was moved from that original cemetery over to Oakland, but there's no record of him. I wonder how many others didn't get moved. There are many strange stories of things that happen over in that part of town, and I will just leave it to your imagination what those strange stories might be. There's always weird things being dug up in those houses in that area. Some of the folks here have their tombstones, as you can see around me, but there are about 18 that are unmarked graves. And if you ever come up here, and I recommend that you do, it's a little hike up the hill, there are wavy parts of the ground where the coffins have all rotted away, probably along with the bodies in the ground underneath them. And hence we have this wavy pattern to the ground up here. They're buried basically in 3 levels, maybe 4, depending on how extensive the burials are. I'm gonna say about 4. And so these marked graves that you see here, it's pretty much gone back to nature up here, although over the last 10 to 15 years that I've been visiting this area, it's certainly cleaned up compared to what it was. The trail is much easier to hike up than it used to be. Some of the interesting stories of some of these folks, and these are the pioneers of Warren that are buried here. This one right behind me is Caleb Wallace. He was a lawman And his gravestone mentions Caleb Wallace, who in the discharge of his duty, to which he was called by a civil officer, was inhumanely shot dead while in an attempt to arrest Jacob Hook. And it goes on with some dates and things. March of 1821. Well, Jacob Hook was a wealthy lumberman in western Pennsylvania. Another man was injured in the shootout. But it turns out Mr. Hook was acquitted of his charges of shooting Mr. Hook. In fact, the Warren Sentinel said that this is a libel against Mr. Hook, and it's there for eternity. So I think nowadays if there were a shootout, the shooter of the law officer might not have gotten off quite as easy, but things worked a little different in the 19th century sometimes. Over here, let's see, I believe it's this one right there. It's faded so badly I can't read the stone, so I'm going to pull my notes out to see exactly what it says. Juliana, consort of Francis DeLong, died October 12th, 1832, age 44 years. I should mention that many of the people who were in Pioneer Cemetery did get buried down in the main cemetery. Mrs. Patience Gilson, wife of Warren's first settler, John Gilson, was buried in Wetmore up in North Warren, whereas Patience is buried down here in Oakland in Section T. In the Old Town Cemetery over across the river, nearly all the graves the folks were buried facing east, so that on Judgment Day, when St. Michael blew the horn awakening the dead, they would all rise up so they were facing east. That isn't the case down in Oakland. They're facing all over the place. So I believe that superstition kind of went away by the 1850s or so when they moved all the graves over. So that pretty much concludes our tour of the cemetery part of Potter's Field.